Essentially what Mkhwanazi seemed to believe was that the minister was trying to protect people involved in the world of organized crime against investigation.
Was the minister acting within his powers, or was that an overreach?
The police have a detection rate of 11 or 12% in relation to murder.
The element of farm murders and the genocide that's apparently happening in SA, how real is it? Welcome back to Palatable Politics, where we make politics palatable. With me, your host, Lt-Gen Mkhwanazi. Welcome to the show. In today's session, we're going to be discussing policing, policy, operational. We're going to touch on the Marikana Commission, the ad hoc committee, and the allegations made by the Provincial Commissioner Mkhwanazi. Here to give us insight is an expert in policing, crime, prevention, and public security, Mr. David Bruce. Welcome to the show.
Hi, yeah. Thanks for inviting me.
Before we go into the nuts and bolts, can you let us know how you got into crime and crime prevention, corruption, security, just the whole shebang? What got you in there?
Well, there's a long answer to that question, so I'm not really going to properly answer your question. But basically, in the mid-1990s, there was a lot of work that was being done on police reform, as it was then called. Mm-hmm. And there were jobs open, there were jobs available then. And I was someone who had been involved in kind of, as a kind of writer in, let's say, anti-apartheid activities. I'd worked on a student newspaper and things like that. I'd worked for various kind of publications. And so in many ways, you know, what I am is someone who tries to write clearly. And so there was a job opening in the policing field that came up in 1996, and I was looking for work at that point, and for kind of one or two reasons, it seemed that I was a suitable person for the job, and so I was started working in that field as someone who knew very little about policing. In some ways, though, I'd prepared for the job interview by reading a bit, but beyond that, I hadn't studied the field. So I've been, but that does now mean, so at the end of this year or beginning of next year, I will have been working in this field for 30 years. But it's, I've learned on the job rather than having any special qualifications that I had prior to starting my work in this field.
Okay. They do say practice is the best form of learning, but you do have a master's in the space, right?
Yeah, which I got after I started doing this work. Yeah.
Now, going into the July, what was this thing? The July press conference by Mkhwanazi. How would you summarize what he said, just to make it palatable for our guests?
Yeah, well, there's basically a very serious allegation of, the key element for me, which relates to what we're going to talk about, is this, that there was the instruction that the minister issued to close down the political task team, the political killings task team. Was an instruction which was motivated by irregular considerations. That essentially what Mkhwanazi seemed to believe was that the minister was trying to protect people involved in the world of organized crime against investigation. And so, in some ways, what he was pointing towards was a broader issue, or a broader issue of collaboration between people in the world of organized crime, people in the political world, people in the SAPS and in other policing institutions. I mean, what we've heard, for instance, in the last week specifically raises questions at the very least and, seems to implicate personnel within the Ekurhuleni Metropolitan Police Department as being potentially also implicated in some kind of irregular dealings with people involved in very serious types of crime in South Africa.
And at the core of it, political interference, which is where I think we should start. How would you define political interference?
Okay, I don't know if I would, define it. I would, sort of talk about how it's come up as an issue in South Africa in the since the mid 1990s, since the inception of democracy in South Africa. And so I think, particularly if you I haven't written the whole history of this, so I wouldn't try and give the exact, but particularly from the 2000s, there started being questions raised. I think even in relation to the criminal justice response to the arms deal in the late 1990s. I think there were even questions raised there, but then particularly in the early 2000s. And so the one, most obvious way in which it manifests itself is where, political actors try and use their influence over the police or other criminal justice institutions to protect people that they are associated with, or to protect other political actors or themselves against the operation of the criminal justice system. But there's other ways. The one big and very it's partly provided for in the Constitution itself, but also in the legal framework, is that members of the executive, people like the President, the Minister of Police, the Minister of Justice, have a lot of influence over senior appointments in organizations like the SAPS, the NPA, and then also in, for instance, the Independent Police Investigative Directorate. So, those powers can be used in a manner which is aligned with the principles and kind of aspirations of the Constitution, or they can be used towards irregular ends to appoint people who are going to be kind of politically compliant and to and do their work in a kind of politically partisan kind of way. So there's a lot of scope for irregular influence in those powers. There's other things that have so for instance at Marikana, there was allegation, suspicion, which was, if you look at the report of the Marikana Commission, it went into this issue into quite some depth. And while it didn't say that it didn't conclude that the minister had, interfered in operational policing, let's call it, that at Marikana, it also said that it couldn't. There was considerable reason to suspect that the minister had been involved, and so it didn't exactly exonerate him, but it just, the conclusion of the Marikana Commission was that, just there wasn't enough kind of evidence before the commission for it to kind of positively confirm that the minister had influenced the police to launch this operation, and so maybe some of your listeners aren't familiar with this, but on the 16th of August 2012, there was a police operation at Marikana where the police killed 34 miners. And many people justifiably see it as being important to also mention that there were 10 people who had died in the days prior to that. So overall, in the entire episode that took place at Marikana, there were 44 people who were killed.
All 44 killed by police, or
no? The 7 of them were killed by the miners. 34 of them were killed by the police on the 16th of August. And then there was a clash between the police and some of the striking miners on, I think it was Monday the 13th of August that year. And so in that clash, 2 police officers were killed, but then also 3 miners. So in total, the total number of people killed in the entire episode were 37 people killed by police. But then in the days prior to the 16th of August, there were 7 people who were killed by, at least, there was a large group of miners involved in the strike. Not all of them were involved in violence, but it would appear that some of them were responsible, well, specifically for the killing of the 2 police officers, for the killing of 2 security guards, but then also for the killings of 3 other miners who, had, it would seem, had been killed by some of their colleagues.
One of the things in the Marikana report, and I forgot the exact terms that were used in it, but it referred to Minister Nathi Mthethwa at the time.
That's right.
That he's, whether it's interference or intervention, which I guess we'll also clarify in the next step, but was that he said that there should be, whether it's presence or they should protect, whether that was the source of his intervention or interference. How do we clarify, or how do we distinguish what is interference and what is intervention?
Well, you see, I mean, I think maybe that's something that we're going to try and get into in a bit later in the conversation, because you see, the one thing you see, and this is in some ways the key thing that I do have to say in relation to this point, because you see, there's this idea, let's call it in the public domain, that it's legitimate, it's valid for politicians to have influence over policy, but they mustn't influence police operationally. And so there's this idea that there's quite a neat distinction between policy and operations, and that the politicians can legitimately or validly do the one, but not do the other. But when from my engagement with the issue, some of the core points would be something like this: that it would certainly, if there's a specific investigation or a specific person who, it would certainly be inappropriate for political influence to be exercised to try and ensure that a specific person is investigated or is not investigated, or to try and in some ways influence the outcome of a specific investigation. That would be one. In the case of Marikana, the operational role of the police was to manage the effectively a type of public order situation. They were dealing with quite a complicated and difficult public order situation involving a large number of people. But several people had been killed, as we've talked about already. But on the day before the 16th, there was no violence. And then, so there was, the argument is, at least, let's just say that there were no urgent grounds for the police to intervene on the 16th. But, the evidence suggests that there was a political directive that the police received, that the police must disarm and disperse the miners on the 16th. And so, they did pursue this thing of trying to negotiate a resolution to the strike through that morning. But once it became, I think that, if I'm subject to correction, I think that, the miners were demanding that Lonmin, the company that owned the mine, should negotiate with them. And they said they would disarm if Lonmin agreed to negotiate with them, and so they refused to surrender their weapons. Those of them who were armed, at least, because the majority of them were not in fact armed, but so it seems that in that case the what we would call irregular political interference took the form of an instruction to the police to say, you must disarm the miners by the end of the day on the 16th. And so that took effectively, took the questions about judgment about how to manage and handle the actual police operation out of the hands of the police leadership of the operation.
Drawing back to the the Mkhwanazi allegations, from an independent expert's view, does it look like there was unjust political interference?
Okay, so now, I just want to clarify that in many ways, I don't want to go here. Okay, I think there's a whole process that is unfolding right at the moment, where there's in fact two processes, as many people are aware. There's the Madlanga Commission and there's the ad hoc committee. Okay, and so, I think I would make just a few observations. Okay. The one thing is that, what I think is very important is a point about the manner in which, where irregular or improper interference is exercised, it is very rare that it is exercised in the manner in which it was, it is alleged that it was exercised in this case. And what I mean by that is that generally, one of the ways of trying to ensure that, there is no irregular interference on the police is to require that any political directives to the police are reduced to writing. And what we have in this case, and so this isn't a case where the minister can deny that he gave this instruction. What we are now discussing is whether the instruction was irregular. But in many cases where politicians are exercising their influence in a kind of underhand way, it will not be done in a way in which it can be, subjected to scrutiny in this kind of way. So that's the one thing. The second thing is that if you look at some of the discussion that has taken place before one or other of the processes, I think maybe there's been more of this. I think it's been, in front of both, but, so for instance, some of the people who have appeared before the ad hoc committee, what they have said is that it isn't necessarily the substance of the instruction, it's the process. And so there's some people have referred to kind of protocols or whatever it is, conventions or whatever it is. As far as I'm aware, none of these kind of so-called conventions of consultation or whatever it might be are actually embodied in writing, and again subject to correction. But So some people are at least making the argument that, it isn't inherently irregular for the minister to issue an instruction on a matter of this kind, but there should have been another process involved. Other people should have been followed, and so there's a conversation about, or argument about whether that should have been the interministerial committee, which seemingly hasn't sat for quite a long time, or should he have at least first spoken to, for instance, the national commissioner, and so on and so on. So those are some of the arguments. And okay, yeah, go ahead.
So with that said, what are the powers of the minister?
Well, you see, there's 3 or 4 that we can easily list. The one is that, for instance, as the Marikana Commission kind of spelled it out, they referred to 3 types of authority. There is the Constitution uses a phrase about the minister being responsible for policing. And so there's a sense that the minister has some kind of overall responsibility for, political, one might use the word oversight, but it goes beyond that, executive authority over the police. There's then also in section, what is it? It's 206, 1 and 2, a reference to the minister has a power to issue something called national policing policy. And it's supposed to do that in consultation with the provincial executives. And so we could talk about that, but maybe we want to move on. But then there's a very interesting provision, and in some ways it's the heart of the matter in this case, because then in section 207.2 of the Constitution, or 207.1 or 207.2, okay, but
in that section of the Constitution,
in section at the beginning of section 207 is a reference to, it says that the national commissioner is responsible to exercise his authority or her authority over the police, subject to the national policing policy, which we've already heard about, and the directions of the cabinet member responsible for policing. So, it seems to sort of imply that there's 2 things. They're not one and the same. There's something called national policing policy, and there's something else called directions. And, what is apparent and is that we haven't, in South Africa, no one has given sufficient attention up to this point to what exactly the authority to issue directions, how it should be understood. And so, in some ways, the heart of the matter is, what is a reasonable way for the minister to issue her or his power to give directions, and how should that be understood? And in fact, it's at this point, it's an unresolved issue. There are, there are, for instance, recommendations in the Marikana Commission and in the report of something called the Panel of Experts. It's a report that was finalized in 2018, though it was only released in early 2021. And which do go into the issue a bit, but in many ways it's something that hasn't received proper attention by, for instance, lawmakers and people concerned with political authority in South Africa.
If you were asked to make a recommendation as to how we could fix it and just clarify and refine the Constitution on that matter, how would you go about it, or what would you say?
Okay, well, there's 3 things that I would say. Okay, so basically, I've looked into this issue a bit, and there's a specific writer who's written quite a lot about this. It's interesting that for some reason, so for instance, in kind of England, there's this, in some ways, there's this idea which kind of is seen to originate there, that the police are operationally independent. and that the police must be operationally independent. But in some ways, that idea is inconsistent with the idea of on the one hand with the idea of accountability. So at the very least, their powers or authority should not be seen to be exercised in a manner which is independent of accountability. But then, in a democratic country, the executive is seen as, in theory at least, and we would like to think that, sometimes in practice. I mean, I'm not. I'm not cynical about this. I think you do get, in democracies, governments which are serious about their responsibility to try and represent people and to advance the interests of the public as a whole. And so, the executive are in some ways democratically elected and appointed through a process which has at its foundations the will of the majority of people, and they are supposed to be an instrument for getting the state administration, including the police, to perform their functions in a manner which is responsive to the interests of the majority of people. So the idea of democracy isn't that the State Department should operate in a manner which is not responsive to the influence of the executive. And so it's broadly a question about how do democratic societies ensure that the executives are of such a nature that they genuinely do advance the interests of society and the people. It's not necessarily a straightforward or easy thing to achieve, but but your question, your question was how to control. So the principle would be firstly this idea of that a requirement, and so okay, what I was saying. Sorry, I'm just going to step back. So on one hand, there's this idea of the operational independence of the police,
okay,
and so that's that idea has a lot of kind of it's in some ways been kind of popularized. So a lot of people are almost aware of this, have the sense that the police are supposed to operate in this independent and kind of impartial way. But interestingly, it's in so Australia has a policing system which is not a centralized one like in South Africa. There's six or so different Australian states, and each of them has a different police service, and each of them has a different separate legislature.
So
and they've each passed separate legislation, and many of them have spoken to this issue. And so there's various different approaches, interestingly, in Australia, but also in New Zealand, to how to regulate this. But the one basic point is that the requirement that political directives from, let's call it the Minister of Police, to the National Commissioner of the Police must be in writing. A second point, which is embodied in some of these legislative instruments in some of these Australian jurisdictions and so on, is the idea that prior to issuing any directive, it's provided for in, I think, legislation in the state of Queensland in Australia, is the idea that the minister must first consult the head of the police service. Okay. And the third point is just an idea of kind of regulating exactly what can and cannot be provided for in such regulations. And so, in some Australian states, they say you can only deal with the following in your political directions. But in other states, or for instance in New Zealand, they say, the minister can issue directions, but not on the following. And the kinds of things that are excluded are, any political directions related to a specific investigation, or to the investigation of a, specific investigation or prosecution of a specific person. But then also similarly in the kind of public, in the public order domain, in the area of public protest and so on, a minister is prohibited, I think, for instance, in New Zealand, from giving directions specific to how specific police operation is conducted relative to a specific group of people, and so on. And there are, I think, one or two other things. So, for instance, ministers are also not allowed to issue directions related to individual appointments, or human resource questions relating to specific people in the police, and so on. And so, for instance, that's one of the things that the current police regulations would be in violation of, because the current police regulations in South Africa, in fact, give the Minister of Police incredible amount of influence over a wide range of senior appointments in the SAPS.
One of the parts that's come out in the commission has been the issue of resourcing. What's your understanding of what makes up of resourcing? It's personnel, it's financing, and how that has impacted the ability of whether it's a task team and the overall SAPS unit to investigate and prevent crime.
Right. Okay. Yeah. So the one thing is just also that what having been working in this field for a fair amount of time, is the one thing is the term resources is in some ways just like police jargon. It often just means personnel.
Okay.
But I mean, when we're talking about, it can be basically personnel and, vehicles, other types of, physical resources. So, in a public operation, resources, let's say, would be personnel, but also the vehicles involved, other the weapons and equipment used and so on could all just be seen as resources, I guess. So,
and currently that is run through the budget process with the minister and the commissioner, I would assume.
No, you see, I mean, I think, the argument that I would make here is something along the following lines. Okay. That, you see, the point is that where the area, this idea that you've got on the one hand policy, and on the other hand operational issues. Once you look at how political influence on the police, the whole kind of political system actually operates, that whole distinction falls apart on the issue of what you could call use of police resources. So now the one thing is that a hell of a lot. So for instance, let's start with opposition parties rather than the government. That if one looks at a lot of the manifestos in last year's national election campaign, a lot of them will be saying things like, there should be a task team or specialized units established to deal with this issue or that issue or whatever it is. Or, and so, often they're foregrounding specific types of crime. And then they are saying that, there should be dedicated resources, dedicated police resources allocated towards dealing with that type of crime. Or the current resources such as, what are they called? The family violence and sexual offense, and they're known as FCS units. Their scope of authority includes, let's call it domestic violence, sexual offenses, and the abuse and violence against children. Okay, so they'll say we should be allocating more resources to these units and that kind of thing. So I mean, I think that there's a clear argument here that essentially, on the one hand, this is this can be seen as a matter of policy, that, the questions about crime priorities are matters of policy. On the other hand, this is very much about the use of police resources, and therefore it is about operational issues. If you're saying, that this amount of the police budget must be allocated towards expenditure on these kinds of units, that very clearly has operational implications. The one thing is, it does mean that there are less resources available for dealing with other types of crime and so on. So this is the argument that this idea that there is some kind of neat distinction between policy and operations. Once one actually looks at, in some ways, the kind of bread and butter of political influence over the police, and what one might call, legitimate political influence and legitimate political concerns about policing, and the legitimate operation of democratic politics, then a lot of it, not necessarily always to the best of ends, but a lot of it has very directly to do with the use of police resources and has clear operational implications. And and saying that this is not operational is, it doesn't make very much sense. And so, and so that's basically just then, raises a serious question about the validity of this idea that, you can, this issue of the political influence, the legitimate exercise of the minister's authority can be reduced to a question about policy versus operational issues. Yeah.
I understand what you're saying.
Yeah.
However, like saying we are a democratic state, and if you do have a DA leader, for example, John in this case, would go around and saying that we are going to prioritize gang violence or something like that, and if they are voted into power, surely they should have that right or power or whatever to influence policing to that extent. But once again, like you said, that now it goes into the realm of the operations. So how does one manage that?
Yeah, you see, so I mean, that's why I would go back to these points about, let's call it the three things. That the one was the principle that any political directive to the National Commissioner from a member of the executive, let's just say, okay, let me just make my 3 points, because there's another important point that I want to make. But the 3 points are: any political directive to the National Commissioner from the Minister of Police must be reduced to writing. The second one is the idea that it must be prefaced, let's say, by, it must, beforehand, the minister should consult with the National Commissioner. So there's the National Commissioner as a kind of expert insight into the issues that the minister is about to issue a directive on are first considered. And the third thing is that this kind of what I call minimum core set of issues that, I think it is kind of valid to establish as a matter of principle that the minister should not be able to give political directives about the investigation or how the police are dealing with any specific individual case or any specific individual person, should not be and likewise should not be able to give specific directions about the practicalities of a specific policing operation, and 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 then other things like, so for instance, shouldn't be able to influence human resourcing decisions related to, for instance, appointments, promotions, things like that. So I think you can those three principles should be embodied in legislation, and I think there are examples that we can learn from in that regard.
With that said, the suspended minister on leave did write that directive to the National Police Commissioner, that one on the 31st of December. In doing that, was the minister acting within his powers, or was that an overreach?
Well, you see, I mean, I think I said earlier that in some ways I don't want to preempt the conclusions of, for instance, the Madlanga Commission. I think the points I made were, in the one observation was that we should recognize that it was in writing, which is, so for instance, if you look at, there was a point where Lt-Gen Mkhwanazi was appearing before the ad hoc committee, and it was Julius Malema who was asking him about this episode, I think it was in 2011, no, maybe 2012, where he was placed under pressure from the minister to withdraw the disciplinary proceedings and withdraw the suspension of someone called Lieutenant General Richard Mdluli, who was at that time suspected both of various serious violent crimes and of being implicated in corruption. And but he had in fact been appointed as head of the Crime Intelligence Division through an irregular appointment process. Interestingly enough, but showing these things. But in that case, Malema asked him, how was this, when you were placed under pressure to reinstate Lieutenant General Mdluli, how was this done? And Lieutenant General Mkhwanazi, who was the acting national commissioner at that time, said, well, he had this meeting with the minister, and he said, okay, well...
This is the late Minister Mthethwa. Yeah.
This is the late Minister Mthethwa, yes. He said, I had this meeting with the minister, and I said to the minister, if you want me to do this, put it in writing. I think he used the word, put it in black and white. And the minister wouldn't do that. So, that's a red flag for, when a minister is trying to do something but doesn't want there to be any public scrutiny of, what he or she has done, is this kind of, type of, behind the scenes kind of influence, which isn't, which a minister is not willing to reduce to writing. So I think that and that isn't the final word on the matter. Because sometimes irregular influence can be exercised quite brazenly. So, for instance, if we look at the whole episode with the closure of the what were they called? The Directorate of Special Operations, popularly known as the Scorpions. They were finally closed in 2009, but it was a saga that unfolded over a couple of years. And so, that was done in broad daylight type of thing. There was a resolution that was passed at the Polokwane conference saying, using a kind of false pretext, a selective reading of the Constitution to kind of motivate for this unit to be shut down. And then, it was done very much in full view of the public. It's just that the motives were irregular. So this business of trying to ensure transparency isn't a kind of foolproof way of ensuring that politicians don't exercise irregular influence over the police. But it is something who, at least where you have police officers who are motivated to serve, let's call it as police professionals, who do aspire to doing their jobs in an impartial way, which is not influenced by irregular political considerations. It does give them a bit more type of, let's say, muscle room, something that they can fall back on to kind of resist irregular interference.
Just going back to the Scorpions. So the Scorpions were done away with and replaced with the Hawks, right?
Yeah, that's right.
What's the difference between the two?
Well, you see, I mean, the one thing was that, I mean, there's a long answer to the question.
The palatable one?
A short, there's things which don't really explain the differences, but the Scorpions were in the National Prosecuting Authority. They were, the NPA Act provides for things called investigating directorates to be appointed within the National Prosecuting Authority. The SAPS, the Hawks are a type of, supposedly a kind of quasi-independent unit within the SAPS. And so actually when the Hawks were established, there was enormous scope that was provided for in the legislation that established the Hawks for irregular political influence to be exercised over the Hawks. And there were a series of constitutional court judgments which in some ways reduced the scope for that kind of influence. But the one kind of Achilles heel, let's just call it, that still remains is this issue of senior leadership appointments. So there's basically the legal provisions still provide enormous power on the part of the Minister of Police in relation to his or her influence over the senior leadership of the appointment of various people, including the head of the Hawks, the deputy head, and the various provincial heads of the Hawks.
On the issue of appointments of the senior people, one would assume that whether it's an institution, company, etc., that a CEO, example, would want to have a strong relationship, whether it's an MD or a general manager, etc. So having the CEO have a say or participating in the process of appointing whether it's a general manager or a senior person, is that something that is wrong?
Yeah, you see, so this is in some ways the conversation right at the moment, you see. So there's various provisions, some of them in the Constitution. So for instance, the President, him or herself then, has basically the authority, in terms of the Constitution, carte blanche authority to just appoint the head of the National Director of Public Prosecutions, effectively the head of the NPA, and then also the SAPS National Commissioner. So and in the past, particularly under some of our previous presidents, maybe there's some kind of obvious candidates there. That power has been misused. The one thing is that sometimes just people would be appointed without any serious consideration being given to exactly who was being appointed. It would be like virtually an overnight affair. But then, or it seemed to be. But then the other thing is, that one can deliberately appoint people who are going to be politically pliable and who are going to be amenable to enforcing the law in a politically selective way. And so, and so those, in the past, some of our democratic presidents have abused that authority. So I mean, the conversation about this is, because on the one hand, so that's, those are constitutional provisions. On the other hand, provisions related to, for instance, appointments of the head of the Hawks, the head of the IPID, the head of, for instance, the SIU. Those are provided for in legislation, but still give either the president or other members of the executive, sometimes what is almost seems to be a unilateral power to just kind of appoint these people. And so, on the one hand, some people, always have this kind of impulse to want to kind of take these powers away from members of the executive and give the powers to someone else. And then it becomes, establish some kind of supposedly completely impartial committee with the necessary expertise and so on to, and so, but it seems that, if the kind of sensible things, let's call it that, which seem to be, consistent with constitutional provisions, with the existing constitutional provisions, would be that one could nevertheless have legislation that provides that, one would have require a process to be followed in relation to each of these appointments. One would, have some kind of panel which at the very least makes recommendations. I think there's, some people have reservations about the degree of transparency that should be applied in these processes. I think, yeah. So I mean, a lot of people see transparency as generally always a good thing, but it can bring dynamics into these processes which, in some ways, aren't necessarily helpful. But nevertheless, so there's a question about the degree of transparency that these kind of panels should, these panel processes, should they be subject to full public scrutiny or not? But nevertheless, basically there seem to be reasonable models in terms of which, at the very least, there should be an open process through which applications are made, and that the relative merits of the different candidates are rigorously interrogated, and that particularly where we're talking about constitutional provisions, where the Constitution does provide that the ultimate authority does reside with the president, then it would seem reasonable that what these panels should do is provide the president with a short list of their preferred candidates. And, yeah.
Taking a bit of a sidestep now, and linked but not directly, the effectiveness of task teams within the policing sector. How effective have those been in our 30-year history, or maybe even a shorter period?
You see, that's the short answer to that question is we don't know. Okay, so the one thing is that what we're not very good at is that kind of assessment and evaluation. How would one evaluate a kind of task team? To what degree, for instance, if a task team receives, this amount of financial resources, that would be one consideration. But then, one can't simply use a metric to do with the number of cases, because, and I think it was a point that was made by the National Commissioner in his statement that he submitted to the Madlanga Commission, is that, different types of investigations have different levels of complexity. So in some cases, one conviction might be much more of an investigative achievement than half a dozen convictions in other types of cases. So it's not a straightforward matter. But even in terms of the basic level, the basic information that is provided about the performance of task teams. There's very little that we actually have on, information of that nature at this point. The one thing is there's been a bit of, greater transparency about the kind of achievements of the political killings task team. Than there has been with many other of the task teams that have been established. I mean, the one thing also that I think, if we're talking about this issue, we should also talk. You see, the police have a terminological distinction between what they call specialized units and task teams. And so supposedly a specialized unit is a dedicated long-term type of unit. So for instance, some or all of the provinces have dedicated organized crime units. But then task teams are supposed to be specific interventions which supposedly are not, are supposed to address a specific problem and then be kind of disbanded. And so we, and so this question would be a question about both of them. But the broad issue is that, so for instance, the one distressing statistic that we have in South Africa is that the police have a detection rate of 11 or 12% in relation to murder.
Well, what does that mean?
Okay, so basically the detection rate, again, there's a more complex definition, but the simple definition is it involves cases where a suspect is identified and arrested. Okay, and so supposedly they've solved the case by arresting someone who is reasonably suspected of being the perpetrator. And so it isn't the same as it doesn't necessarily guarantee that the person who's been arrested is going to be convicted. But we've got the implication is that less than 11% of murder perpetrators are convicted. Okay, and so the one thing is that you see, I mean, if you engaged in the crime issue in South Africa in the policing field, what is apparent is that there's a lot of very different types of serious crime. Depending on, whatever, some people feel very strongly that X is, should be seen as the biggest problem, and other people feel very strongly that Y should be seen as the biggest problem. And, both of those, types of crime validly, can be seen as a serious part of, the crime problem. And once one looks at the overall nature of crime in South Africa, there's easily a dozen, if not more, contenders, for types of crime that require kind of dedicated attention. And so, but the difficulty is that the more, task teams are in some ways a stopgap type of measure. Basically, if one's looking at a situation where one's overall detection rate for a crime such as murder, which is supposed, classically in, virtually any country, you'll find that murder receives more investigative attention than most other types of crime. So, what that says, if we've got an 11% detection rate for murder, it says something very worrying about, how we're responding to the bulk of crime in South Africa. And so basically, in some ways the political reflex seems to be, establish a specialized unit, establish a task team, establish a specialized unit, establish a task team. But the broader issue of, you could see it as an overall question about the overall strengthening of this South African police service. But, on this issue of crime investigation, specifically strengthening the detective component of the South African Police Service. I think there's a very clear case that can be made that that's been, badly neglected over the last 30 years in South Africa. And so, I'm not completely against. I mean, I've motivated. So, in fact, in 2012 or thereabouts, I wrote a piece motivating for establishing dedicated units to investigate political killings. So, so I'm, insofar as that might have been, anyone feels that that was a mistake, I'm might be seen as partly responsible for that. But the broad issue is that, there needs to be, basically, to respond to the overall crime problem in South Africa. We can't just go on establishing specialized units and task teams. We have to have an overall investment. We have to have a broad view and a broad strategy for our detective service.
But practically speaking, how does one improve our ability or improve that detection rate?
Well, you see, at
this
the
point,
nuts
at
and bolts of this
11%,
thing, start with police recruitment.
Okay.
So South Africa, dating back, it's something that we've inherited from way back when, is that the police recruitment is I think the requirement that people have a matric was possibly during apartheid, it might even have been, that wasn't even a prerequisite. But now, basically what our whole police system is premised on the recruitment of matriculants. It's a decentralized recruitment system which is implemented in each of the provinces, and so we have an en masse recruitment of matriculants. So every year we recruit in the region of 10,000 matriculants into our police system. So the one thing is, even in terms of the level of rigor that's applied, in terms of the selection of those people, once one's got that type of approach where one's recruiting people at such a high volume, inevitably what happens is that you can't apply a very high, very rigorous standards in terms of ensuring that, because they receive an enormous number of applications. I think it might be over, it runs into the hundreds of thousands. They use some kind of process for whittling that down to about 30,000. But even, once trying to screen, 30,000 applicants in terms of trying to ensure that you get the best 10,000 out of those, that would be an enormously time-consuming process. And inevitably, considerations to do with, the quality of one's recruitment are compromised in that process. So that's, the one thing. But secondly, we are in the 21st century. There's sophisticated types of things that police investigators have to do. The one thing is that, since we've established a human rights-based due process model of criminal justice, which requires that, people are, arrested and prosecuted on the basis of a police investigation. That in itself makes it, crime investigation a tough, difficult job requiring a sophisticated type of skill. But then we've got things like organized crime. We've got complex financial crime. We've got corruption, which is incredibly difficult to investigate in many cases. And so we've got all kinds of things that require, we've got the whole question of what's called digital forensics and the use of data analytics in policing. And so, we need to, it's reasonable to kind of assume that relying on the recruitment of matriculants to generate the right kind of personnel for this kind of policing system is likely to be inadequate. And so, I'm not suggesting that we must stop recruiting matriculates. But, I think what we need to clearly move to is a much more kind of varied recruitment system where, there's, on one hand, there's, possibly, for sake of argument, 7,000 of the 10,000 positions might be available to people who are, whose only qualification is a matric. But then, another 3,000 are people with some other kind of qualifications or, expertise.
With regards to the aspect of training and development within the policing, how capable are they?
Well, again, you see, I would say that we don't know. So, there was this window in the 1990s where there was a bit of a greater level of access by civil society researchers to the police, and a bit of work that was done at that point on, looking at what is happening within the police training system. But, one thing that's long overdue is, some kind of, independent kind of audit or sort of verification assessment type of process of our current police kind of training system, because, I think there are grounds to believe that it isn't necessarily, doing, what we would want it to do. But, it's a combination. So, because, the challenging thing is that once one starts thinking about kind of the SAPS as an organization, the more one thinks about it, the more one speaks to people about the problems in the organization. There's so many different things that need to be fixed, and one can't fix everything at the same time. A lot of people will say, well, let's start with the leadership and things like that. But, you can't, reconstitute the leadership overnight either, type of thing. So, there's a need for basically a strategic approach. We have to say, these are our priorities. This is how we want to strengthen our police organization. And these are strategic priorities for how we're going to do that. So, I would, for instance, argue that, it isn't even a question of starting with recruitment. It's a question about starting with strengthening our human resource function within the police, starting with strengthening our training function within the police. So people talk about, what the basics. What are the basics? But people might have wildly different conclusions about what these basics are. But some of the fundamental things to me that that one needs to really focus on if one is going to move ahead with establishing a far more effective policing system is what is it? Strengthening the mechanisms within the police service for performing functions like recruitment and training.
Okay, we've covered that part largely, right? And sufficiently. You've given us a lot of insights and solutions. One we haven't touched on, the element of farm murders and the genocide that's apparently happening in SA. How real is it?
Okay, there isn't a genocide. Okay. It goes to this issue of, from my point of view, you see, my observation working in this field is that you have these kind of victim constituencies. So a lot of people, have had bad experiences of crime. And, those, experience of crime are sometimes grouped together as this or that or whatever. So, so white farmers as a group, there have been a number, a substantial number of white farmers who have been attacked in their homesteads, killed sometimes in an exceptionally brutal way. So, so to suggest that that group of people shouldn't be concerned about, it doesn't make sense to suggest that they shouldn't be concerned with the crime that they're experiencing, that the crime that they're being exposed to. What then happens then is that, what these groups find themselves trying to do is elevate the problem that they're experiencing above the problem that everyone else is experiencing. And so in some ways what we have is like this kind of competition in South Africa as to, what kind of, crimes should receive the most attention. Should the killings of white farmers be seen as more important than any other kind of murders in South Africa, for instance? And so, and so this question about, crime priorities tends to come down to which victim constituencies have the most kind of voice in South Africa. And so what you have is that there's mobilization on the part of certain types of victim constituencies, but other types of victim constituencies have less of a kind of voice. And the net result of that is that they might also, suffer in extraordinary ways from crime, but because they are less effective or less organized in terms of articulating their own experiences and so on, the types of crime that are impacting on other people are kind of neglected. And so, until you have groups in South Africa that have been, have exceptionally valid concerns about the victimization that they are exposed to, or the victimization that the group that they are representing has been exposed to, and have had a lot of impact on, on our perception of what should be seen as priorities. But but there are other constituencies that whose victimization might be seen as largely neglected.
You've mentioned a number of solutions, right, throughout. But if you were to go down and give us a magic bullet, excuse the pun, to SA's crime, political interference, all of those things, what would it be? Like the one single thing that you think would have the biggest impact in changing and making SA a safer place? What would that magic bullet be?
Well, you see, I mean, magic. There isn't a magic bullet, obviously. Okay, but I mean, what would have the greatest potential is if one has. So you see, the thing is that the kind of political system is one where civilians are appointed into these kind of roles. So, for instance, a minister of police, to some degree, we've had a whole number of ministers of police with very little actual background or in policing, very little knowledge or insight into policing. And so what they tend to do are very superficial things. One of those things is appoint task teams. Okay. And so what one needs one needs a minister of police with a greater level of insight into the policing system. One needs a minister of police who is willing to engage on this terrain of policing policy. Because you see, there's these constitutional provisions that authorize the minister to issue policing policy. But in many ways, that is an authority that's largely been neglected by ministers of police in South Africa. In some ways, this authority to issue national policing policy is something that hasn't been exercised by our ministers of police. Okay. And then it can't revolve around one person. I think this person needs to have the right kind of policy support in developing policy, because the SAPS is incredibly complicated policing organization, and it's got a wide range of different policing capacities and functions that it and so as I've just said, a lot of what the political interventions tend to be incredibly superficial, aren't actually likely to be meaningful in bringing about profound improvements in our policing system. And so one wants a minister who hopefully has some appreciation of the policing issue, a minister with some willingness and some ability to grapple with the policy issues and with the right kind of political support. And, I think, if one really is going to move this thing forward, as in, step up to another level of policing in South Africa, then it would require something, quite kind of profound at that level. Otherwise, we kind of moving around the kind of deck chairs type of thing, but we aren't really going to be grappling with putting in place, a police service and a policing system, because policing, isn't just about the SAPS. And we, needs to not only think about the SAPS when we are thinking about policing, but we need to, if we are going to move to something much more, formidable in terms of an effective type of policing system and police service, then there's a different type of change that we need to bring about. And I don't think we've, begun to really even kind of appreciate what that might look like.
Thank you for making time and making this whole security, policing, and everything that we're going through palatable.
Great, it's a pleasure. Thank you very much for inviting me.
Guys, you watched the interview. Like, subscribe, share, comment. Let us know what you think our magic bullet could be. Palatable Politics.